Hi, my name is Brad, and this is episode 3 in a YouTube lecture series about intonation in English called Listening for Meaning. In episode 2, I discussed two types of meanings, interpersonal and textual meanings, and the prosodic and periodic systems that give expression to these meanings. In this episode, I'll reflect back on these in terms of an important theoretical concept called metafunction. The first two lectures have covered a lot of ground. My aim in these has been to provide a broad introductory overview, sort of like a menu page for the rest of the series. Then I will explore specific aspects in depth in subsequent episodes. A couple of viewers asked about Praat, a free and very popular speech analysis software tool. In this episode, I will briefly introduce Praat, and then in later lectures I will show the ways in which Praat can be very helpful in analysing intonation, but also point out some limitations in its use for intonation study, or traps for young intonation analysts. I also received feedback on difficulties in identifying intonation choices and accounting for their discourse functions. I will endeavour to provide some phonological analysis practice in each episode, including in this one. In the next episodes, I will also begin to go into detail on how to analyse phonological choices out of the stream of speech sounds. And in later episodes, I will explore the discourse functions of such phonological choices in more depth. So in previous episodes, I introduced the theoretical approach of this series, that of systemic functional linguistics, or SFL for short, and outlined key intonation systems within the SFL description, interpersonal and textual systems of intonation. In this and the next episodes, I want to begin reflecting on these systems in terms of SFL theory. A theory represents a particular way of seeing and understanding phenomena. Each theory has its own language, terms and concepts, and ways of studying things. Here is a quotation from the American linguist Kenneth Pike. I have translated his original use of the term men into people in square brackets here for a contemporary audience. The list and kind of things people will find will vary radically if they adopt different theories as tools with which to search for these units. The theory is part of the observer. A different theory makes a different observer. A different observer sees different things or sees the same things as structured differently. When you consider that a very influential paper in the 1960s by Dwight Bollinger was titled Around the Edge of Language, Intonation, you will see what Pike meant when he wrote that one's theoretical approach can determine both what you see and the way in which you see it. Within the SFL approach, intonation is seen as being an integral part of language, expressing grammatical distinctions no less important than other language choices such as mood, theme or transitivity choices. Intonation is meaningful, and SFL is a meaning-based theory of language. Thus, in SFL, intonation is considered part of language rather than around the edge of language, because intonation choices make distinctions in meaning. In episode 2, I discussed the different types of meanings that intonation choices make, interpersonal and textual meanings. In this episode, I address these two different types of meanings and two other types in terms of an important part of SFL theory called metafunction. The concept of metafunction accounts in very general terms for the functions we use language for in our everyday social life. As Halliday puts it, metafunction refers to the relation between the functions of language and the nature of the linguistic system. That is, in Halliday's well-known way of putting it, language is as it is because of what it has to do. And note, I have, of course, added in the intonation transcription here to these quotes. The intonation was perhaps implied, but not transcribed, in the original written texts. So, language has evolved in ways that reflect its basic social functions, with distinct sets of systems and structures for the different metafunctional uses of language. As Halliday and Greaves put it, these sets of systems are called metafunctions because they are functional at a very abstract level. They represent the functional contexts within which language was enabled to evolve. So language has evolved to represent our experiences in the experiential metafunction, to construe logical relations between these experiences in the logical metafunction, to interact with others in the interpersonal metafunction, and to create coherent text that is relevant to its context in the textual metafunction. As I also mentioned in episode 2, the different types of meanings I discussed in the previous episode, interpersonal and textual meanings, that is, the interpersonal and textual metafunctions, have different forms of expression, and I use the terms prosodic and periodic systems in this respect, referencing a book on which I am a co-author, Modelling Paralanguage Using Systemic Functional Semiotics by Knorr et al. In fact, these terms prosodic and periodic systems are only mentioned once in that book at the end of the chapter on intonation, but they are important concepts for understanding how different systems of language in the tone group and the clause, and systems of other modes of communication such as gesture and other vocal features, work together to make complex meanings in multimodal discourse. They are also important in understanding how the different metafunctions are expressed. As Halliday discussed in a 1979 paper, drawing on work by Kenneth Pike, the different metafunctions have different forms or structures in the way they are expressed in discourse. So, in the experiential metafunction, language is used to represent our experiences as configurations, as in this example. The rain soaked my hat today. So in a clause, the transitivity system represents our experience as a configuration of a central process, here soaked, participants in the process, rain as participant causing the process, and my hat as participant being impacted by the process, as well as circumstantial elements related to these processes and participants, here today telling us when the process occurred. Experiential meanings are expressed in a segmental form, what Pike refers to as particles, that is, as bits and pieces that are components of the larger configuration. The image to the right, which is from the 1979 Halliday paper, is used to represent this configurational type of structure with a central process and participants in that process and circumstantial elements around the process. Intonation is not involved in expressing experiential meanings, but textual meanings are mapped onto experiential elements in a clause. That is, the experiential elements are made relatively more or less prominent by textual choices. Thus, experiential meaning is involved in understanding the discourse functions of textual choices. An intonation discourse analyst needs to analyse the experiential meanings in a text in order to understand which experiential items are made prominent in textual choices and why. Logical meanings relate these experiential configurations to each other. The system of logico-semantic relation creates logical relations between these configurations such as elaboration or cause and effect, while the taxis system relates these configurations in terms of dependency relations, as independent or dependent clauses, for example. Because my hat got wet, it needs drying out. Logical meanings are like experiential meanings in being segmental in nature, but as characterized in Martin 1992, they form part-part relations rather than part-whole constituency relations. Logical meanings create chains of logical relations between configurations, such as clauses, rather than being components within those configurations. As I will discuss in a later episode, intonation is involved in making logical meanings via specific discourse functions of particular tone choices in sequence. Example here, the tone 4, tone 1 sequence is used to indicate a logical relation of dependency called subordination between these two tone groups and thus the clauses they contain. I will discuss in a later episode how it comes to be that the same tone, tone 4, as well as tone 3, can have both logical and interpersonal discourse functions depending on the discourse context and their function. Halliday doesn't give a visual representation of logical structure as for the other metafunctions, but creates detailed abstract representations of logico-semantic and tactic relations in his work, which one can find, for example, in his Introduction to Functional Grammar. This image is from the 2004 edition revised by Christian Matheson. And the same publication describes the logical metafunction as having an iterative structure. The interpersonal metafunction enables us to use language to interact with others, most importantly by exchanging meanings through dialogue, and by adopting stances in relation to what we are representing, for example expressing how certain we are about something we are stating. The mood and tone systems I discussed last episode are central systems in the interpersonal metafunction. So in this example here, it rained today. Oh yeah, it really did just absolutely pour down. Interpersonal meanings are expressed prosodically, spreading across individual units and stretches of discourse, what Kenneth Pike called field-like expression. In the top row of the box in this example is the image Halliday used in his 1979 paper to represent this prosodic form of expression. We can see this principle of prosodic spreading in this short dialogue here. Firstly, in the first move in this example, the tone choice spreads its expression across the entire tone group. It rained today. I will discuss this choice further in the next slide. Secondly, in the reply, an interpersonal prosody of intensification is spread across various choices. Oh yeah, it really did just absolutely pour down. So we see this interpersonal choice spreading across choices in lexes such as really, did, absolutely. The word pour, which is itself a lexical intensification of rain. And then the tone 5 adds further interpersonal intensity to this move. This is the nature of the interpersonal metafunction. The expression of an interpersonal stance tends to multiply across many choices, spreading across the domain where its meaning applies. Thirdly, note how in the pre-tonic salient syllables in the reply, before the tone 5 contour on pour, before the tone 5 tonic begins on pour, one can already hear the speaker gearing up for the tone 5 rise fall contour. Oh yeah, it really did just absolutely pour down. This is another example of the prosodic expression of interpersonal choices spreading across the units where they occur, in this case throughout the pre-tonic as well as in the tone itself. Note also here that the term prosodic is used in my work differently to its use in much of the literature on intonation. Prosody is used in phonological studies to refer more broadly and somewhat less precisely to any phonological phenomena that extend beyond the confines of a phoneme. I will come back to this aspect in the next episode. As I mentioned, this prosodic spreading form is also manifested in the phonological expression of the tone choice. Here is a Praat representation of my performance of the first move in this example. The blue line represents the pitch, and the two tiers with text show the tone group analysis and the division of the tone group into feet. I will go into more detail on using Praat and the different levels of analysis of the tone group in the next episodes. It rained today. This tone is the sharp rise, fall, rise, tone 2 variation that I mentioned in the previous episode, familiar from the incredulous expression, who, me? This rise, fall, rise contour in this example is stretched across the whole tone group unit here, even though it begins on the tonic rain. It rained today. There is in fact two distinct rising contours within this tone, rather than its normal characterization as a rise, fall, rise or fall, rise contour. But as prosodic expression, while the tone contour begins on the tonic syllable with the initial rise, its full expression as a tone choice continues through to the end of the tone group unit. And this tone choice is to be taken as a whole, as one choice spread prosodically across the whole unit, not as two distinct choices or two distinct contour types. I will come back to this tone choice in the next episode, where I compare this prosodic approach to intonation to the segmental approach that has dominated intonation studies since the 1970s. And I'll show how the SFL metafunctional perspective is crucial in correctly understanding both the phonological nature of this tone choice and its discourse function as the expression of interpersonal meaning. The textual metafunction enables us to create coherent text that is relevant to some context by assigning different textual statuses to the various meanings in a text. Textual choices tell us what is important in a text, what a text is about, and what is its point. For example, through choices of theme and tonicity. The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain, but the sun shines everywhere. Textual meanings are expressed periodically as peaks and troughs of prominence in often regularized rhythms, what Pike called a wave-like expression in language. Thus, in this example, there is a significant jump up in pitch on rain as a choice in what Sue Hood has termed supersalience. As I mentioned in previous episode, I consider supersalience to indicate a new topic, roughly corresponding to the paragraph in writing, and thus such resets in pitch height have been referred to as phonological paragraphs. These choices in supersalience often occur on the theme, which in English maps onto the first content lexical item in a clause, here, the rain. Or more importantly, they map onto what Martin, drawing on work by Peter Fries, terms the hypertheme, as a new topic in a conversation or other type of text. In this example, there is also normal salience on mainly, and then as a higher level of textual prominence, there is tonicity on Spain, plain, sun, and everywhere. Redan Martinek has shown how there are larger waves stretching across larger scales in discourse. Another wave of textual meaning is formed by silent beats in an established rhythm, which I call pauses. For example, in the two silent beats after plain, mainly in the plain, but the sun. As Sue Hood has shown, these are very important in organising the overall text at a macro scale, for example, signalling new phases or stages in the lecture genre. So, not only do we represent our experiences in configurations of meanings, make logical connections between these experiential configurations, and use language to interact with others in sharing these meanings and our stances towards them. All of these meanings are also assigned some relative levels of importance in relation to each other, thus weaving all these meanings together into a coherent text that makes sense both within the local context of what has previously been said, and also in relation to their situational context. For the second part of this episode, as promised, I want to do some intonation analysis, both for practice and to exemplify the metafunctions at work in a text. This is a short excerpt from the 1938 film production of the George Bernard Shaw play Pygmalion, which I mentioned in the previous lecture. You can listen to this text in its original film form at the link in the description. I will now model these choices myself based on my phonological analysis of this film scene. And note, I have amended one of my analyses from the previous episode. I previously had the first they as salient, but I've listened again and now think that, although pronounced very distinctly, as is all of Liza's speech at this stage, as with stays in the tone group following, I don't think they is salient. I mentioned last episode how difficulties in analysis are often significant in some way, and I drew attention to how in this text Liza is at this point very careful in her pronunciation. That is part of the plot of the play. She is showing off her newly acquired elocution skills. So this also explains why it is quite difficult to distinguish choices in salience and tonicity in this text. Liza articulates every syllable very clearly, but this is not the same phenomenon as salience, which is a semiotic choice, where one word is made relatively more prominent than others for purposes of textual meaning. Will it rain, do you think? The rain in Spain, they say, stays mainly in the plains, they say. How too true, Miss Doolittle. But in Hampshire, Hereford and Hertford, hurricanes hardly ever happen. Do they? Hardly ever, Miss Doolittle. How awfully funny. What is wrong with that, young man? I bet I got it right. Killing. As I mentioned before, I will go into detail about how to analyse phonological choices in later episodes. Also remember, you can slow down the speed of YouTube videos so that the intonation choices, particularly tone choices, are easier to identify. And you can replay any part to get hold of any particular content, as you would reread parts of a textbook. One very useful technique to replay parts of a YouTube video is to press the left arrow key on your keyboard. This takes you back 5 seconds, allowing you to effectively do the same thing in video mode as we tend to do when we are reading a difficult passage in an academic text. You can repeatedly go back over difficult parts until you have mastered them. As I said in an earlier episode, this YouTube series is intended to be a sort of multimodal textbook. This scene is a pivotal one in the film. It represents the moment when Liza is first presented by her tutor, Professor Higgins, to try out her new skills in elocution and deportment in a new social setting. And it is also in this scene that we see Liza assert herself for the first time in this new social context. And as I will show, the actor's choice of intonation is pivotal in this. Note also that some of the material in this part of the lecture is presented in a chapter on intonation that I co-wrote with Bill Greaves in the Bloomsbury Companion to Halliday, which I've put the reference details for in the description. So to begin with, Mrs. Higgins, the professor's mother, asks, "Will it rain, do you think?" This is an initiating move, and note the supersalience on will, introducing a new topic. With an entirely interpersonal function, the question move is not at all meant to elicit experiential content about the weather, but functions interpersonally to make light social conversation, or small talk, after an uncomfortable silence amongst people who don't know each other. The tone to rising pitch contour, as I discussed in the previous episode, is the default or unmarked choice to ask a yes-no question, along with the polar interrogative mood. Likewise, the tonality choice of one tone group for this projecting clause complex is also unmarked. Although there are 2 clauses, it is unmarked to have a projecting clause, here do you think, together as part of the same tone group as the clause it is projecting, here it will rain. However, here the normal order of projection is reversed. The default would be, do you think it will rain? With the initial do you functioning to indicate the polar interrogative mood choice. But because the order of the clause complex is reversed, with the projecting clause coming second, not first, therefore it is the first clause that carries the subject finite ordering, will it, indicating the yes-no question move. The addition of do you think at the end adds to the interpersonal prosody of politeness or deference for this initiating move. The marked tonicity choice on rain, with do you think as post-tonic, confirms that this is not really a question about what the others think about the prospect of rain, but is just adding interpersonal politeness, so it is not given textual emphasis of its own, as it would if it were a genuine question. Liza's reply manifests her nervous adherence to Professor Higgins' instructions previously. As Higgins says to his mother earlier in this scene, quote, "I've taught her to speak properly, and she has strict orders as to her behaviour. She's to keep to two subjects, the weather and everybody's health. Fine day and how do you do, you know. And not to let herself go on things in general. That will be safe." But Liza's reply also manifests the obvious fact that while she has practiced well her elocution lessons, she has no idea about how to negotiate the social relations of this context in her discourse. She misinterprets Mrs. Higgins' small talk as being, in fact, a genuinely experientially orientated question about the weather, which is fortuitous as Henry Higgins has been teaching her to speak like a lady via the repeated use of this meaningless phonetics primer sentence, which Liza therefore dutifully capitalises on to show off her newly acquired skills. "The rain in Spain, they say, stays mainly in the plains, they say." Liza assigns two tone ones in sequence to the projecting clause and the beginning of the projected clause. "The rain in Spain, they say," which construes a logical relationship of elaboration between these first two tone groups. The projecting clause is presented via this sequence of tone choices as being an elaboration of, or a bit more background information on, the main clause that she has started. As in Mrs. Higgins' initiating move, this is of course a projecting clause complex, but here the first projecting clause is interpolated into the middle of the main projected clause, and as is often the case with interpolation, this is done so at a lower pitch height shown by the downward arrow as an interpolated topic, as a sort of inverse supersalience. The second "they say," as in Mrs. Higgins' move, comes after the clause it projects. But unlike in Mrs. Higgins' move, Liza's two projecting clauses, "they say," each have their own tone group, and the meaning is to give this projecting clause in each case some textual status, some importance in the discourse, as though it is important to highlight these projecting clauses. The silent beats or pauses to introduce the interpolated projecting clause also help to give them textual significance. The first instance thus comes across as having some conspiratorial significance. "The rain in Spain, they say." The second is less confident, perhaps now almost as a modalisation or externalisation of responsibility. "This is what I've been told to say, but now I'm not so sure." "Stays mainly in the plains, they say." Interpersonally, to complete the main projected clause, she employs the more interpersonally charged tone 5, the rising-falling contour. As mentioned in the previous episode, the tone 5 contour adds interpersonal commitment to a statement. I call it the wow tone, or perhaps in Liza's case here, it's just a bit of conversational flair and interest to her contribution to the small talk, part of her elocution training. Professor Higgins starts to try to get Liza and the conversation back on track, echoing her tone 5 in what we could consider a sort of dialogic interpersonal prosody across these speaker turns. And then he employs supersalience on but, an unusual choice of salience. Salience is by default normally occurring on content lexis rather than on grammatical items. But here he's clearly attempting to initiate a new topic or hypertheme via supersalience for the conversation. "How too true, Miss Doolittle. But in..." However, Liza, clearly on a roll, interrupts with another of her phonetics primer sentences, this time one that is clearly designed for her to practice her pronunciation of the h sound. "Hampshire, Hereford and Hartford, hurricanes hardly ever happen. Do they?" But by the end, one can hear again that she has now really lost confidence and is starting to realise that while her pronunciation is going well, the actual conversation, her participation in this small talk, is perhaps not going so well. Liza's final move, the polar interrogative, do they, is again out of place in such small talk, presenting as a genuine question about people's views on the weather. But perhaps we can take it to mean she is now genuinely questioning whether there was something wrong with what she has said. We can also note that Liza's turn uses marked tonality to emphasise the main words. But again, this is all elocution, sounds with little or no sense being expressed, rather than an example of Liza having mastered the textual metafunction in this new context. As mentioned, throughout this dialogue, there is an intermittent prosody of tone 5, expressing interpersonal commitment. In Liza's moves in previous slides, the extra interpersonal investment seems oddly out of place for such mundane experiential contributions. However, Professor Higgins plays along, continuing the tone 5 prosody. Hardly ever, Miss Doolittle. But in Freddie's turn, his use of tone 5 seems more genuinely suited to his meaning. Freddie finds Liza's replies to be highly unusual, surprising, and amusing. How awfully funny! Freddie's response here has an interpersonal prosody of appraisal. There is the tone 5, which intensifies his interpersonal reaction to Liza's small talk, and then there is awfully, which also intensifies his appraisal. So this again illustrates the prosodic nature of interpersonal meaning. It tends to spread across stretches of text, layering interpersonal choice upon choice to build up and intensify a particular interpersonal stance. Freddie's laughter, words and intonation thus prompt the real Liza to emerge, confident again but now experientially and interpersonally, socially empowered. It is at this point that Liza, in my interpretation of this version of the play, asserts herself in this new social context by challenging Freddie. What is wrong with that, young man? I bet I got it right. And the actress Wendy Hiller's use of tone 2 for both tone groups in her turn here is crucial. As mentioned in episode 2, this rising pitch contour can be used with the word interrogative to enact deference. It can have a sense of may I ask? We could easily imagine may I ask replacing young man at the end of this first move. What is wrong with that, may I ask? Which would be a little bit like Mrs. Higgins' Will It Rain, do you think? Here, there is perhaps a sense of may I ask in the rising tone with the word interrogative. But in Liza's second tone group, the tone 2 is chosen with a declarative mood, and this is what Halliday refers to variously as a challenging or protesting key choice, which are good glosses for the sense of Liza's use of this co-selection in mood and tone here. And there is a definite sense of challenge about her whole turn. In fact, considering that interpersonal meaning is prosodic, spreading out across units in which it appears, one possible interpretation here is that the two tone 2s form an interpersonal prosody across her turn, across both mood choices, a prosody of challenge or protest. However, another possible way of interpreting this is in terms of the logical metafunction, that the two rising tones are like the logical use of two tone 1s in sequence that we saw earlier, that the two tone 2 choices here in sequence construe a relationship of elaboration between the two parts of this turn by Liza. In most tone sequences, it is the second tone in the sequence that tells us what the interpersonal choice is for the whole turn. In this analysis, therefore, the challenging tone 2 declarative gives us the interpersonal choice, while the tone 2 sequence construes a logical relation of elaboration between the two clauses. I will come back to these sorts of issues in later episodes in analysing the discourse functions of intonation. So Liza emerges in this turn from out of her phonetics trainee shell to assert herself in her new social context, challenging Freddie through her words and her tone choices. Freddie's reply to this challenge is to wholeheartedly agree with her, submitting both to her assertion of authority and her charms. He has, of course, already started to fall in love with Liza and finds her new small talk captivating. killing. And again, he uses the tone 5, which is really a sort of prosody throughout this whole conversation. Here he just means, yes, you are killing it. Your small talk is great. Absolutely. This analysis shows just some of the many different choices that go to make up a very short excerpt of spoken text. The totality of all the choices in clause, lexis and grammar, and in the tone group that together go to make up what we perceive at great speed as the meaning of the film play at this point. But what if we vary these choices? To what extent can we say we still have the same play? Here is another version of this play, or a transcription of my analysis of it, this time from a 1973 BBC production. The link is in the description. What was wrong with that young man? I bet I got it right. So the first move is now a straight content question with its unmarked tone 1, while the second move has the sharp fall-rise tone 2 variation rather than the straight rising contour. At first I thought it might be the falling rising tone 4, but then I listened and the tail of this tone choice rises quite steeply at the end, which is distinctive of this sharp fall-rise tone 2 that I've talked about before. I'll come back in the next episode with more detail on how to analyse tone choices. Meanwhile, textually, there is no silent beat after the first tone group as in the previous version, which reduces the textual significance of the first move. Such intonational variations in the performance of a play's script raise the question, is this the same line as in the previous version or a different line as a result of these differences? Are they just nuances of essentially the same meaning, or different meanings being expressed in the intonation choices? Consider this version, which comes from an anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, told to me by a friend about the final performance in a long-running staging of the play, this time this line being delivered by a well-known actress who is clearly tired of Freddie or perhaps the actor playing him. What is wrong with that young man? While the differences between the two previous versions are quite subtle, this is clearly a completely different line with a different meaning. What is wrong is now a separate tone group. Is made salient, bringing this interpersonal element to the fore textually, while what is non-salient. And wrong, rather than that, is now tonic, making it the focus of the first tone group. This move, or this tone group, is now about what is wrong with that young man, referring to Freddie, rather than about what is wrong with that, referring to Liza's small talk, which Freddie has laughed at. A different focus makes a different meaning, and a different text in terms of what the text is about. And that young man, also now a separate tone group on its own, has 3 salient syllables in sequence. This is not really about assigning textual emphasis to each lexical item, but about emphasising the utterance of as a whole, and indeed the whole term, what I call a textual prosody. These textual ripples of salience here add to the waves of tonicity in this move, all of which add up to emphasis on the turn as a whole. I think you will agree that this version makes this line mean something entirely different to the previous versions. One could say at this point that we really do have an entirely different text, a different Pygmalion. And yet this line is precisely the same line in terms of words and wording as in the previous versions. It is the intonation choices alone that make this line mean something so entirely different to the previous versions, and we must assume to the playwright's original intent. It is perhaps part of the humorous effect of this line that it is intonation as a subversive semiotic force that creates a text so absurdly at odds with our expectations based on a conventional reading of the play script. So, to come back to the Bollinger quote at the beginning of this episode, in SFL, intonation is far from being around the edge of language in this spoken text. It is central to it. Intonation is language, or a part of language, along with the other meanings expressed through words and wordings. At least we can consider intonation part of language if we consider the term language to mean broadly the use of speech to communicate meaning. The etymology of the word language goes back to ancient Proto-Indo-European via Latin, originally meaning tongue or with the tongue. Intonation is primarily created further down the vocal tract in the vocal cords rather than by the tongue. But then phonetic features that make words such as nasalization, voicing and lip position are also not articulated with the tongue. More on the phonetics of intonation in relation to phonemics later in this series. I have thus shown in this lecture that the theory we use to study language determines what we see, what counts as language, and how we see it. I've shown how SFL metafunctional theory enables us to distinguish different sets of language systems in terms of their social functions and formal expression. And I will continue to show in subsequent episodes in this series how knowing these different forms of expression, prosodic and periodic systems, is helpful in the analysis of both phonology and the discourse functions of intonation.